Welcome everybody to this new episode of the KNIME 101 webinar series. As you already know, this KNIME 101 series is a mentoring series. So we ask the top users of the KNIME community to share some pearls of wisdom from their experience with KNIME newbies. In the last episode, we had Michele and Emilio, and they gave us an introduction about KNIME Analytics Platform for beginners. You can find the recording on the KNIME TV channel on YouTube. Just go on YouTube and search for KNIME 101 all together without spaces, and then you will find the video. Today, we take one step further in our beginners learning journey, and we talk about the 10 good habits that can make your life easier when you're building workflows. For that, we invited Philipp Kowalski, a long-time KNIME user, a pluri-decorated with badges and awards. He also recently became a KNIME certified trainer, but he actually has been sharing his experience with others via the forum, via the YouTube channel, via the workplace. He has been sharing his experience long before he was officially recognized as a KNIME certified trainer. Philipp works at Siemens as a digital enablement agent, which means that he's responsible for the digital transformation of the finance departments within Siemens. 2 words about Siemens. Well, everybody knows Siemens. Siemens is a German conglomerate, multinational technology conglomerate, leader in industrial automation, distributed energy resources, rail transport, and health technology.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and welcome everybody to this session, to this webinar.
I see a workflow. So what is it doing?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit difficult to say, Rosaria, because what you see here is it reads some Excel files, it somehow merges these Excel files obviously together, it calculates something, we don't know what exactly. And that already leads me to my very first tip, which is always label your nodes. It gets so much clearer for yourself and also for the peers that you're working with if you start labeling your nodes. So how could this look, for example? Let me just show you how exactly the same workflow looks when it's properly labeled and annotated. Here, for example, we see immediately I read a customer file, I read a transaction file, then I merge these two. Here I'm calculating some transactional pricing, etc. Plus some added benefits here. I also use workflow annotations here. I see that the reading the data, read the data import happens at the beginning. The data transformation happens after that. So this makes these workflows and these automations so much more speaking, which I personally think is a great behavior to have, especially if I come from, like me, if you come from a finance background, you use today things, for example, on a monthly basis. If you open up a workflow like this on a monthly basis, you immediately know what happens where. Plus, that's an added benefit, I guess, you have also documented your whole process with every single node. You know exactly what happens where. If you have a new customer file, you know exactly where to click. So that would be my very first tip about labeling your nodes, using workflow annotations to make it easier for yourself. And if you're sharing your workflows with others, which you should do, so spread the word about KNIME, then it makes it easier for them as well to understand what happens where.
Great. But do you write also something about data in this labeling?
No, not really. If I want to understand a little bit more about what my data does, there are several features, and the first one I'd like to introduce you to here is the table statistics. So here at the bottom right at the node monitor, you can see that we have this little statistics button, and I use this mainly for looking, okay, what data types do I have here? It is very important to understand the data types. Is it a number? Is it a text? Is it a date that we're dealing with? Because just imagine I'm dealing with the purchase date that we see here on the screen, and I want to eventually extract the month from it. Well, right now I see it's a string, so it's a text, and probably I would have difficulties with that. As always in KNIME, there are many ways to do this, and really, like, I use the table statistics mainly for looking at the data types to identify what kind of data do I have here, so I can then brainstorm a little bit, what can I do with it? Build averages, build totals, extract date components, count words, or whatever.
But so these measures that you have in the statistics table, you would be able to also calculate them with a
Yeah,
node.
absolutely. And as I said, there are always many ways to do things. So another way that I really like a lot and that I also use a lot is my next tip. I use a lot of group by nodes for numerical verification, because the group by node is a really easy to understand node that allows us, for example, to build an average, to build a max and a min. And if we just look, for example, at what this group by node here does, we, for example, see our quantity that we have calculated here has an average value of 7. However, there are some outliers. There is a negative quantity, minus 123. There is a very, very high max quantity, 653. So when I want to do some statistical calculations, some averages, some means, etc., that probably would ruin my data set or my data transformation, my data analysis. And therefore, I use a lot of group by nodes to have a quick look at it. So that's the node way, quote unquote, of doing this. And I now know, probably I need to dive a little bit deeper into that quantity column and have a look at what happens there, why I do have these strange outliers. So I make sure that the analysis afterwards works well. That would be my third tip. So the node way of checking your data and values and data set would be, for example, for numerical values, the group by node.
So I see that, yeah, basically you use it also to find the outliers or whatever problems you might have in the data set.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let's go to tip number 4. Let's see.
Yeah, and you see here, for example, if I try to, just like I said, try to exactly, if I try to extract some date and time parts from that purchase date column, I see an error. Now, again, I come from a finance background. I used to use a lot of Excel. And if you have been using spreadsheets in general, you probably know these error messages like NA, division by 0, or some other cryptic error messages, which for me, okay, I understand division by 0 from basic math. I know it's not possible, okay, but this usually does not tell me anything that could go wrong and or that went wrong. And what I see here, especially if I just hover over this node, I could immediately see, oh, look, KNIME tells me exactly where the problem is. No cryptic error messages. No, it tells me, well, you know what? There is no date and time column to extract from, because otherwise this node would have taken it by default. So these error messages here, by hovering over it, or also if you look here on the left-hand side in the monitor, there is another option. We see exactly the same error. Even better, if I click this little arrow here, it leads me exactly to the node that caused the error. So I have multiple ways to find the errors, and I see it also here and can read it, and it tells me immediately what I need to do to correct these kind of errors. So no more nasty Excel error handling, so to say.
So not trying to understand the error in the dark. You have plenty of places where you can check your error and fix it.
Yes.
Okay, so but do you have, now you mentioned Excel, do you have something also for the Excel users?
Yes.
Of course you have.
Yes, I do. And that's probably also one of my favorite tips. So you usually consider yourself an advanced Excel or spreadsheet user if you start to use lookup formulas like, VLOOKUP, cross lookup, HLOOKUP, maybe even index match formula combinations. The problem is these are sometimes so difficult to understand. So it's like VLOOKUP, opening parentheses, and then $3 semicolon, $A1 colon, blah, blah, blah. So these are really hard to understand. And I really like the speaking way, how we can ditch all these messy lookup formulas that basically nobody understands or are very hard to understand with a few nodes in KNIME. And my recommendation would be, there are basically two nodes I would recommend for, let's say, a more simple lookup where you just want to bring together two different tables. Like in this example, I have my purchase data and I have an additional dictionary table that holds my product names and also the product categories. So I want to enrich my data by this. I would use a value lookup. The value lookup node configuration is really super easy. It just asks me which is the lookup column and which is the column from the dictionary table in which we want to look. Again, no more $A, $1 stuff here. We have speaking names, column names here. That makes it way easier. And one thing that is true for this node and for the next one is also I basically can select all of the columns that I want to include here. Again, that is not something that is possible, for example, in Excel. In Excel, the search term always has to be the leftmost column. And if you just copy paste it over, you have to adjust it. Here, I just do one node instead of multiple copy paste operations to do it with the value lookup. If you're, let's say, if you're merging or lookup conditions are a little bit more complex, I would recommend the joiner node here, because this allows for multiple conditions to use when we want to join the data. So here in this example, just imagine you want to have you want to give a special discount for a customer region in a specific time frame. So it needs to be the right purchase date and it needs to be the right customer region. So I have two conditions already. Then I would use the joiner node. One thing I love about the joiner node is the visual indication here that it does, because this one just tells me, okay, we keep everything from the transactional data and just enrich it by what comes, for example, from our dictionary table, right? And again, here at the bottom, we see this with these includes and excludes boxes, is I have to do this once, even if I want to merge 50 different columns. I only need one node for that. Again, of course, I label it correctly. You probably have heard me saying that one before. And then I have my merge data available to further process, again, aggregate or whatever I want to do here. Exactly.
If you want to show again the circle diagram for so that's something that maybe people are interested in understanding better. So that shows the table on, you get the full table on one side and the intersection of the two tables. So this is an easy way to understand the join.
And you already have the hints here as well, right? You see it's a left circle, so left circle and a right circle. And you have these indications here as well. Which one is the left? Which one is the right? We can see it here at the top. And it's a visual indication that in this case, I probably would keep all of my transactional data. And if you come from a data science background, you surely have heard about left outer joins and right outer joins, inner and full joins. But with this visual interpretation, it's good to know it, but you don't have to. You can actually see it in a visual way. And that's something I really do like about all of KNIME, that it is so visual.
Okay, so now that was tip number 5.
Exactly.
What about, you say that all these tools are easy to configure. So what about if I get lost and I don't know how to configure something?
That's another thing. And that's my 6th tip here is you don't have to use Google or these days maybe more ChatGPT, because that can hallucinate. Just use what is already there in your platform. KNIME has a lot of built-in help tools that I really like. Maybe the most important one you can see here in the node repository, because if you hover over a node, you see this little question mark here. And if I click on that, it first of all tells me what this node does, also with certain examples, depending on what node I have selected. Plus, it also shows me what it expects as an input. What data does it expect to get? what data will it deliver. I can see the output ports. Plus, I can also see what happens at the options. So I can have a look and see, okay, how do I need to configure this? And that is already a very good first help. Another help I'd like to show you here is in the expressions node, because expressions are probably not no code, but low code, very speaking still, but you have a lot of formulas here on the right. And if we just look at this and let's just take some very standard formula, like, I don't know, we want to make it all lowercase. We have a explanation here already what this node, or what this function, this expression, this formula, however you want to call it, what this basically does. Again, you don't need to Google anything or ask ChatGPT. It just shows it to you. Plus, it has examples here as well. So the combination of this would be probably like either built in the node, like in the expression node, or also like in other nodes, it's built in, or for example, here. And of course, you also have at the very top a general help button that you also can utilize. Plus, and that's maybe a little bit teaser for a tip in a few minutes, there is some other great features added to KNIME recently as well, which we will probably also talk about, which also cover like helping users to get on the road and running, so to say, with starting with KNIME. Exactly.
Okay, let's move to tip number 7 then. I think we have heard this one already.
Yeah, and that is about talk. I like to give my tables meaningful names. For example, just look again at this, and we can open the resulting table here. We created a pivot table, right? We pivoted, or we grouped by category, and then we pivoted on region and the revenue, basically. However, if you just look here at the column headers, it is a little bit difficult to read. So it's for central, the sum of my transaction value, or for the customer region east, the sum of my transaction value. Yes, you as a workflow developer might understand this, but my recommendation would be, especially if you start sharing this with others, or if you continue to process the data you are using here, would be to give it more meaningful names. And I do this quite a lot. You could use the column rename node or the table manipulator node, which offers a lot of different functions. And here you see, for example, we rewrite the central sum of transaction total simply to central revenue. Just imagine we would export this and send this to our CFO. Probably it would be much easier for him or her to understand if it's called central revenue and has a little bit more speaking names. One other thing, and that's not part of this tip, but that's why I like the table manipulator node also quite a bit, is that you basically can rearrange it already here by just dragging and dropping your column where you want it to be. As with a lot of these transformation nodes, you already see it in the preview here at the bottom, how it will look like. So you immediately see a result and see, is that what I'm aiming for? And you can also, if you just say, I don't want this column, simply uncheck this box and it disappears. So maybe an additional tip on the table manipulator here is to really you lose a little bit of transparency instead of using individual nodes like column rename, column filter, and so on, but it makes your workflows a little bit cleaner. Talking about clean workflows. So that would be my 8th tip. You see this already happening here in the workflow that I'm sharing here quite a bit by seeing these gray nodes, and these gray nodes are called components, and they are basically a package or a bundle of nodes, packaged in its own. Yeah, I don't want to say meta node because that's a different thing, but you can, for example, if you just control click here on this node, you see all the underlying nodes here. And in the modern user interface that we have here, it's really super easy to go back and forth. So you're not losing anything here. You're gaining, order, or don't have those, let's say, messy workflows, because you see here already, those workflows can get messy and a little bit overcrowded pretty soon, pretty fast, because you usually use a lot of nodes for all the individual tasks. One additional hint I'd like to give here in regards to components is there are a lot of great shared components also in the community. So if you run into a certain data problem, it's always worth to have a look at the KNIME Community Hub to have a look at the shared components to see if there is something already there. Again, it still follows this open source idea. You still can click into it and see how it's done if you want to have the learning effect. And one example I have done here, for example, is this public holiday for Germany. In Germany, every federal state has its own holidays. And if you do something, let's say, in an HR department and want to deduct these holidays or subtract these holidays from a data table, a shared component like this could be helpful. Exactly. There's also a little bit a difference between between components and what is called a meta node. Maybe we want to talk a little bit about this as well. So from my point of view, so a meta node is also a bundle of nodes. How can I say this? I prefer components a little bit more because they offer a few more options. For example, with components, you can also utilize widget nodes, which will basically turn your simple workflow, your simple component in a or can turn your component into a full-fledged data app without any coding. And I personally prefer, first of all, to have this option, this additional option for future work to eventually turn it into a data app. And the second thing is, I personally, and that's just a personal feeling, I like the look and feel of the components of the widget nodes a little bit more. They feel a little bit more to what we are all used to from using like these calendar pickers from web apps that you find like everywhere if you book your holiday or whatever. But that's just a personal preference. In general, I would always say modularize your workflows using components for making them cleaner. Plus, one very important additional topic I maybe forgot a little bit is especially, and that's where this public holiday comes in, especially if you have stuff that you do all over again many times, it's way easier to copy paste. And maybe a very prominent example from Siemens is we have a fiscal year that runs from October 1st until September 30th. So our first month is never January, it's always October. And we always have to do these recalculations when we download data, for example, from our ERP systems or something like this, because big companies like SAP, they don't care what our fiscal year is. So for them, the first month is January. So we need to convert this. We develop these components just to copy paste them everywhere and just basically shift them by 3 months. So, and we don't do it all over again. We develop it once and then we use it for ourselves. Copy paste, really super easy, and also share it with our colleagues in the company.
Okay.
All right,
I think number 5, number 9.
Exactly. So we teased this a little bit. So we talked a lot about nodes, about the table manipulator and the group by node. But what if you're totally new to KNIME and you don't know what node to use? Well, there is a feature in KNIME for that as well, which makes it super user-friendly, and that is the KNIME AI feature, or KAI for short. And for example, if I go to Kai, I have several options. For example, you see it here in the left sidebar, and I say, I have revenue data in a transactions file. How can I aggregate it by month? So I don't know anything if there is a pivot table node or not, if there is a VLOOKUP node or not, any kind of aggregation, I don't know. I just ask Kai. Let's see what it returns. So it will basically search its knowledge. And it gives me already some suggestions. For example, here it says, well, if you have some data, you can now read through all of this. But you could use, for example, a group by node. Again, referring back to my previous tip, if I want to understand more what the group by node does, I could click the little question mark, or I could just drag and drop it right from here into my workflow. So out of the AI into the real world, so to say. That is one feature of Kai, but maybe it's not the one that I like the most, because it gets even better. Just imagine we have this transformed data with 15,000 line items. And instead of just asking, I can also ask Kai to build me something. So I can say, please aggregate the transactional value by, what do we want to aggregate it by? Well, let's say by product. Let's see what Kai does. So again, it's doing its magic. It added automatically, I didn't touch it, a node. It followed my personal best practice to label the node. And if we just execute this, let's just see what we have. So just look here, see, here are our dummy products. Of course, this is all just dummy data with the aggregated transactional revenue from the line items that I have. So instead of 15,000 line item, I now have only 13 lines, which is the aggregation of my products. And that is a fantastic feature and a wonderful application of artificial intelligence that everyone speaks of. Kai is also available in other places. For example, you might have seen it before in the expressions node. There's also an Ask Kai button. So if you don't know how to build, let's say, a conditional formula like an if formula, you can ask Kai there and basically also get some help. Let it insert the expression that you need just automatically. So you just have to phrase your question in normal English words, and it works out of the box. And I guess it even works in different languages, right?
We did try the last time, yeah.
All right. Now you have saved so much time by automating all your work. What can you do with that valuable time? And that is probably my 10th tip. Use your saved time wisely and keep learning. KNIME is a fantastic platform. I'm using it now since 2018, and I'm still learning every day. And I love really how KNIME, the solution, the platform, but also you guys support us here in the community with learning. So there are things like cheat sheets, ebooks, the Just KNIME It challenges, the game of notes, all of these different ways of learning new stuff. I'm learning new stuff every day. There are so many notes I still want to learn about, and it also sparks a lot of new ideas. So that would be probably my 10th, or not probably, this is my 10th tip. Yes, maybe on a Friday afternoon, no more night shifts over the weekend to automate the report for your CFO. But use some of that saved time wisely, and maybe just dive a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole that is KNIME, and discover what else it can do for you. So,
summarize?
Yeah, to summarize, again, tip number 1, label your notes and use workflow annotations just to make them clearer and better to understand. Number 2, use the table statistics node to get a quick overview of what data types are in your data set. You can also use the group by node for numerical verification, as we did, like comparing min and max values versus the average. read the error messages either by hovering over the node or going to the monitor tab here on the left. Get rid of all those nasty Excel lookup formulas and just use value lookup and joiner nodes. Use the built-in help tools. There are many, and they are very, very helpful. Make your data speaking by giving it meaningful names. Then if you start to build workflows, try to modularize them, to have copy paste, so reuse the stuff that you have done once, and to make your workflows also a little bit cleaner. Utilize Kai if you need some help besides the other tools, and then again, invest some time into diving deeper into the KNIME Analytics platform.
Thank you. And so let's start with the questions then. We are ready for the questions. So there was one question about the component. Since you talked so much about the components, how can we change the component icon?
Okay. So in the components, you can, let me just see. That's a good question. I guess we can go in here and then go into the info tab here at the bottom. So we are now in the component. You can see this from the breadcrumbs. And here is also a little edit button. So it says edit metadata, and I guess we can select an icon file. I don't have one prepared right now, but here's where you can select the icon. So this is basically when you saw my German calendar days icon, this little calendar icon, this is where I put it. Also, you can describe it here. You can give it tags, and you can also, for example, rename the output port here if you want to make it more speaking. I hope this answers the question.
I think it answers the question. So there is another question. Is Kai creating reproducible results?
From my perspective, yes. So it depends, of course, how you phrase your questions. If you ask the same question, or let's say mainly the same question, maybe in slightly different words, I've experienced, for example, in the case that I've showed you with the aggregation, that it definitely always suggests a group by probably the label is eventually a little bit different, but like in 90% of the cases, it produces reproducible results. Again, as always with AI and large language models, it depends on your prompt. If you change your prompt, if you change your question that you put here into Kai and just say, and then tell me the top one performing product, that is already a different question. And the result that Kai would build, for example, especially when you're in the build mode, would be probably different. So always be careful also what you are not careful, but consider what you're asking it.
It's also that if it's very complicated, there is not only one solution. It can be implemented in many different ways. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another question. Can you implement Python code in a node?
Yes, there are Python scripting nodes and R scripting nodes, for example, if that is your cup of tea. The interesting part here is the philosophy, from my point of view, that is behind KNIME. So if you want to use code, you can. One thing I would recommend here, and that's from own personal experience. So as I said, I come from a finance background. I try to understand programming concepts, but for example, I'm not an experienced Python developer or R developer. And the thing is, one thing to make your workflows more stable and more sustainable is document your code is probably something every developer knows, but also use code. I would recommend only for cases where you can't use, for example, a native node, because if you use a huge code block that only you understand, for your company or for your use case, you're creating basically just another black box. And if you're gone, maybe it's good for salary discussions, but it's for the company, it's a little bit risky and not sustainable. I hope that answers the question. So
it is possible,
definitely,
but you don't advise to use too much.
Yeah, where it's necessary. For example, one use case could be there are, for example, some interesting Python libraries in regards to visualization, and you have some very specific use cases that you find in such a library. Yeah, included.
Yeah, the
embedded.
UChart nodes, they use Python in there, but I mean, you can use Kai to build the whole code.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so next question. This is a bit of a niche question. Is there a schedule to offer a Microsoft Team nodes to send notification instead of emails for actions when a workflow ends? I think it means, let me see if I understood. I think it means if we have a node that interacts with Microsoft Teams.
Mm-hmm. I guess, so my immediate, I have not realized this case, but if I consider how some companies use it, you could do it, for example, if you run your workflow on the Business Hub, you definitely can send a trigger to some other applications, to some other automations. And through that, it would be probably possible to send, so once the workflow is done, it sends a trigger to whatever application takes that trigger, which then in return converts it into a Teams message that says, hey, it is done. That would be one way, but again, to dive deeper into it, we need to elaborate a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to connect to all of these tools via REST, for example. Now, I don't know if there is. I don't know. I think there is not a node that interacts with Microsoft Teams. Another question is if you have some tips on execution.
That's a little bit a generic question. One thing I would definitely recommend is execute early and often. Meaning that's one of the, maybe that's if I interpret the question right, that's a very good question. When I started using KNIME, I was kind of an experienced Excel user, and I thought, oh my God, every single step, one node, isn't that a step backwards? And after a few days using KNIME, it dawned on me that it's basically, from my point of view, one of KNIME's biggest advantages, because it allows you to quickly see, does this node do what I expect it to do? Does it deliver the results I want to see? If not, I use another one. Now we have Kai, I can ask for a different node and so on. Previous times I searched maybe on the internet or in the forums. And that's why I would say, especially when you are developing, execute often. One thing that I have seen with the people I have trained so far is that people tend to forget that it's also, KNIME also has this fantastic automation part, right? Because you just create a workflow once and then you just execute. For example, you change your input file and then you just execute the last node and it runs automatically. I'm not sure if that answers the question exactly, but I guess
maybe next time we could have like a top 10 hints, tips and tricks on execution efficiency or something like that. Next webinar. Okay, so let's see what other questions do we have. So another question, is it better to have a big all-in-one workflow that does everything or multiple smaller dedicated workflows?
From a maintainability point of view, I prefer multiple workflows. I also have use cases where I do more or less always the same thing, just with different data sources. For example, I'm extracting some data from one AWS bucket, transform it and send it to another one. But it follows different, or it connects to different buckets and to different file sets. And I could do it all in one, right? Loop through it and then go through each individual bucket. But I found it's, first of all, easier to maintain. And this is, for example, a workflow I use on the Business Hub. Then it definitely is easier to maintain because you can set different schedules instead of having one big workflow. And the good thing about KNIME is you can start developing one workflow, and afterwards you can just split it up into different things. Or if you're doing the same thing, if you're always using the same AWS connector, as in my case, you can just copy paste. It's as easy as Control-C, Control-V. So you can start with one big workflow and then jump into multiple different workflows.
This might have something to do with the previous question on execution efficiency, because if you are able to separate the different pieces, then you don't need to re-execute the whole thing every time.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. And that also depends, that's also something I have learned, it depends really on what data size you're talking about. If you're talking about, and it sounds a little bit arrogant, but it's not, if you're talking about a few 10,000 or a few 100,000 line items, probably you don't feel the difference. But when it comes to like millions of rows with hundreds of columns, I have seen these use cases as well. Yes, then it definitely makes sense to consider, okay, how do I split it up so it does not take forever to run?
Yeah. Okay, another question. How do you read data from a database?
Well, you have seen this probably at the very beginning here when we saw the Excel readers. So and we also see these CSV readers here, Excel reader here. So these are like individual nodes that connect to a file and read it. For a database, it's slightly different because the structure of a database is different. I used to tell my students usually, it's usually a triage. It's at least connect, select, and read, meaning you need to connect to the database with your database credentials, for example. You need to select the right table because databases, that's the nature of a database. They have multiple tables, and then you can read the data. You can also do some operations like filtering or joining on the database level if you want to. But I would say these three, connect, select, read, are the bare minimum when you connect to databases.
And you have different connectors for different
Absolutely.
databases. So.
A lot like Oracle, all kinds of like SQL-based databases, Snowflake, for example. There are really a lot of connectors to all kinds of databases.
So another question. Now, this one I'm not sure I'm understanding, so I'll try to give what I think I understood from this question. Is there any way to flip the cell values up and down in a defined column?
Well, one thing, I'm not sure if that's a question that's related to sorting. So yes, there is a sorter node. You can sort it up and down. You can also, if you want to have a preview, just like here you see, I'm not sure if we can see this on the screen right now, but in the node monitor here at the in the table preview here, you see this little up and down arrow. So we can sort the data from large to small and vice versa. There is also a sorter node. If you want to, and that's probably a good question, because if you want to do it based on some kind of pattern, if the customer region is A, I want this value multiplied by 5 or whatever it is. Yes, you can also do this. You can use the expression node. You can use rule engine. Also, something that I've discovered quite early in my journey, you go from a formula-based approach more to a pattern-based approach. So your task is not so much to remember all of these formulas. We showed already, we have chi and help and everything for that. But it's more like you think about your data and discover the patterns. So what makes it that I multiply this specific value by 5? When does it happen and when should it not happen? So you start to discover these patterns. And from my point of view, that's also a little bit more satisfying than always copy pasting the same formulas over and over again.
Yeah, I think it depends on, I don't know what he meant there, but if there is a logic behind, then maybe, I don't know, a rule engine node or an expression node or one of those nodes that somehow calculates something. If it's just a shift, then maybe the leg column node.
Yeah.
If it's a sorting, the sorter node. So it depends a bit on the logic that is behind. Okay, so let me see another question. Some best practices for collaboration, some advice on what to do to make collaboration on building a workflow smoother.
Yeah, you might have heard me saying that before. Label your notes. That would be my prime tip on collaboration with others. Another tip that I'd like to share here is share your data together with your workflow. For example, I work a lot, or basically only with Windows PCs. And if you store data locally on a Windows PC, it's very often, if you store it, for example, on the desktop, that it's C user Philipp my data.xlsx. If I send you this workflow, you have one big problem because you do not have a folder that's called Philipp. Yours is called Rosaria. So going from absolute path of your file to a more relative path is quite easy. For example, you could add a new folder here in your workflows. Just call it data. Oops, like so. And then I store my data in here. I can go into the folder and import all my add my files here, my Excel files, my CSV files, whatever I want to do. And then in the Excel reader, it would be just as easy to say, go to relative to, so no more like a local file system, but relative to, and then the current workflow data area, or in this case, the current workflow. And I can just browse to this data folder and select my file here. So that would be also, especially if you start sharing your data with your peers, with your colleagues, make sure that they also have the data source. Because in many workflows that I've seen, data, of course, the data import is at the beginning. And if you don't share the data together with the workflow, then it will be very difficult for your peers to execute them. Besides that, again, label your notes, use workflow annotations. You do get the free process documentation alongside with it. And I can promise you it also gives less phone and Teams calls from people saying, I don't understand what you're doing there.
Okay, so I think we are close to the end. So I think we can close it here.
Mm-hmm.
If you have other questions, please, come send them to us, or you can come to the KNIME Spring Summit next week. It's going to be in Berlin. Philipp is going to be there, so you can meet him in person and ask the question that we might not have answered here. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to remind you before closing this webinar is the KNIME Spring Summit next week. I already said that. And now the second one, I would like to remind you that we have a next episode for the KNIME 101 webinar series, and it's going to be in April 9. It's going to be with Martin Diste, and we will talk about how to build a data app. With that, we close. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Philipp, for granting us your time to explain your best practices in working with KNIME.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for staying.
Thanks.